In Akuka village, where the red earth meets the endless sky, there lived a carpenter whose hands could make wood sing. Abere was his name, and every door in our village bore his mark. Strong doors that kept out the harmattan winds. Beautiful doors that welcomed guests with carved patterns of our ancestors' stories. But this tale is not about Abere. It is about his son, Ike. From the day Ike could walk, the villagers would pat his small head and say, "This one will build doors even greater than his father's." They would point at Abere's workshop, where the sweet smell of fresh wood shavings danced in the air, and declare, "The son of the eagle must also fly." Yet some eagles choose to walk. And some sons of carpenters never learn to hold a hammer right. By the time Ike turned 16, the whole village knew something was wrong. While other boys his age were already crafting stools and fixing broken shutters, Ike's hands trembled whenever he touched his father's tools. The wood seemed to resist him, splitting where it should stay whole, refusing to join where it should bind. Abere would stand behind his son, his strong hands trying to guide Ike's uncertain ones. "Feel the grain," he would whisper. "Let the wood tell you its story." But Ike heard no stories. He felt only the weight of 1,000 watching eyes. Every morning in Akuka began the same way. The roosters would crow, the women would light their cooking fires, and someone would need a door fixed. They would come to Abere's compound, their eyes bright with expectation. "Is the young carpenter ready to help today?" they would ask, looking past Abere to where Ike sat, staring at his hands. Abere's jaw would tighten, but his voice remained steady. "He is still learning. I will come." The visitors would nod, but Ike saw the look they exchanged. That look that said, "How can the son of Abere not know wood?" In the evenings, when purple shadows stretched across the village square, the other young men would gather to share stories of their day's work. Owos would boast about the fishing net he mended. Kahind would show off calluses earned from farming. They would turn to Ike, waiting. "What did you build today?" they would ask, though they already knew the answer. Ike would study the ground, tracing patterns in the dust with his toe. I helped my father," he would mumble. "Helped how?" "By watching." Owos would laugh, not meaning to be cruel but cutting deep. Even the youngest children began to whisper when Ike passed. "There goes the carpenter's son who cannot build a door." At night, Ike would lie on his mat, listening to his father's steady breathing. He would hold his hands up to the moonlight streaming through the window, turning them this way and that, wondering why they betrayed him so. The season of the first rains arrived, bringing with it the festival of new beginnings. It was tradition in Akuka that young men reaching manhood would present a craft to the village elders, a demonstration of their readiness to contribute to the community. Abere spent weeks preparing Ike. They worked in secret, away from curious eyes, on the simplest of doors. Just 4 planks of wood, joined straight and true. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would shame or boast. "Remember," Abere said, sweat beading on his forehead as he watched Ike work, "the wood is your friend. Speak to it gently." Ike tried. Oh, how he tried. His fingers ached from gripping the tools. His back screamed from bending over the workbench. Slowly, painfully, something resembling a door took shape. The day of the presentation came when all of Akuka gathered in the square. One by one, the young men displayed their crafts. Owos had woven a fishing trap so clever that fish would dream of swimming into it. Kahind presented a hoe with a handle so smooth it seemed to flow like water. Then came Ike's turn. He carried his door to the center of the square, his legs shaking with each step. The crowd grew quiet. Even the babies stopped crying, as if sensing the weight of the moment. Ike set the door upright, stepped back, and watched in horror as it swayed once, twice, then collapsed into separate pieces. The joints he had sweated over gave way like promises made in jest. The silence that followed was louder than any laughter could have been. That night, Abere did not speak. He sat outside their hut, smoking his pipe, watching the stars appear one by one in the vast African sky. Ike sat beside him, drowning in the silence. Finally, when the cricket chorus reached its peak, Abere knocked his pipe against a stone. "Your grandfather," he said quietly, "built the first door of this village. Did you know that?" Ike shook his head. Before him, people used cloth and branches. He showed them that a door could be more than a barrier. It could be a welcome. It could be art. It could tell stories. Abere's voice carried no anger, only a sadness deeper than the well in the village center. "I have failed you, father," Ike whispered. Abere turned to look at his son then, and in the dim light of the cooking fire's embers, Ike saw something he had never seen before in his father's eyes. Not disappointed. Not anger. But fear. "No, my son," Abere said. "Perhaps I have failed you. I taught you to hold tools, but did I ever ask what your hands wished to hold instead?" They sat in silence again, but this silence felt different. It felt like a door opening, even if neither could see what lay beyond. The next morning, Ike woke to find his father already at work, the rhythmic sound of his adze shaping wood filling the air. Everything seemed normal, except for one thing. Abere no longer called Ike to the workshop. Without the daily torture of trying to master wood, Ike found himself adrift in Akuka village. He walked paths he had never noticed before, saw corners of life he had been too focused on failure to observe. He discovered old Alma sitting under the baobab tree, weaving stories for the children. Her voice painted pictures more vivid than any door's carvings. He watched her hands move as she spoke, not building anything solid, yet creating worlds. "Why do you not sit and listen?" Alma asked one day, her cloudy eyes somehow seeing straight through him. "The stories are for children," Ike replied. "Stories are for anyone who needs to find their way," she said. "Even Carpenter's sons who have lost their path." So Ike sat and listened. And in the rhythm of Amayam's tales, he found a peace he had never known in his father's workshop. Days passed. Ike helped the women carry water from the stream. He learned the names of birds from the village children. He discovered he could make people laugh with his observations about daily life. Small things. Useless things, he thought. But the villagers still whispered. "What is he doing?" they asked. "A young man should be working, not wandering." Owo's was less kind. "Perhaps he plans to marry rich, since he cannot work," he joked at the evening gatherings. Ike bore it all with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. The rains that year came with vengeance. Not the gentle showers that blessed the crops, but angry torrents that turned paths to rivers and rivers to monsters. On the third night of the storm, lightning struck the communal grain store. Ike woke to shouting and the orange glow of firefighting rain. The whole village ran to save what they could, but the wooden door of the storehouse had jammed. The rain had swollen it shut, trapping precious food inside while flames ate at the thatch roof. "Break it down," the chief ordered. Strong men threw themselves against Abere's beautifully crafted door, but it held firm. "Too well made. Too strong. My tools." Abere shouted, but his workshop was on the other side of the village. Ike watched the panic spread across faces lit by flame. Then, without thinking, he began to speak. Not to the people, but to the door. He spoke as Alma spoke to children, painting pictures with words. "You were born from the great Irako tree," he said, his voice carrying over the storm. "You remember standing tall in the forest, don't you? You remember bending with the wind, not fighting it." The crowd grew quiet, confused. But Ike continued, approaching the door with empty hands. "You know the secret of wood," he said. "That strength comes from yielding. That the mightiest tree survives by dancing with the storm, not standing against it." As Ike spoke, something strange happened. The men who had been throwing themselves uselessly against the door began to move differently. Instead of fighting, they began to work together, pushing and pulling in rhythm with Ike's words. "The tree remembers," Ike continued, rain streaming down his face. "It remembers that its purpose was never to keep life out, but to shelter it. You are not a wall, great door. You are a guardian who knows when to stand firm and when to yield." Old Almayam, standing in the crowd with rain plastering her gray hair to her head, began to hum. Others joined her, creating a rhythm that matched Ike's words and the men's efforts. With a groan like a giant waking from sleep, the door shifted. Just a little at first, then more. The men redoubled their efforts, moving as one body, one purpose, guided by the strange power of Ike's voice. The door opened. People rushed in to save the grain, forming human chains to pass baskets out of harm's way. The fire, robbed of its prize by the rain now entering freely, hissed and died. As dawn broke, the village counted their blessings. Most of the grain was saved. No one was hurt. But all eyes were on Ike, who sat exhausted in the mud, looking as surprised as everyone else. "How?" the chief asked. Ike shook his head. He didn't know. He had simply spoken to the door the way Amayam spoke to hearts. In the days that followed, Akuka buzzed with talk. Some said Ike had worked magic, though everyone knew his family had no such history. Others said it was a coincidence, that the door would have opened anyway. But Abere knew better. That evening, he found his son sitting by the stream, throwing pebbles into the water. "You spoke to the wood," Abere said, settling beside him with the careful movements of a man whose joints remembered years of labor. "I spoke nonsense," Ike replied. "Words cannot open doors. Can't they?" Abere picked up his own pebble, worn smooth by water and time. "When I work, I speak to the wood with my hands. You speak with your voice. Both are languages. Both can build or break." Ike looked at his father, seeing him anew. "But words disappear. Your doors remain. Do they?" Abere smiled sadly. "Every door I've built will one day rot or burn. But Amayam's stories? They live in their hearts long after her voice falls silent." They sat together as the sun painted the sky purple and gold. For the first time in years, Ike felt like his father's son, even if he could not hold a hammer. "What should I do?" Ike asked. "I don't know," Abere admitted. "But perhaps it's time to stop trying to build my doors and start discovering what doors you're meant to open." Ike began spending more time with Amayam, not just listening to her stories now, but learning the craft behind them. He discovered that storytelling was its own kind of carpentry, requiring tools he hadn't known existed. Every story needs a strong frame, Amayam taught him, her blind eyes seeing more than most. Like a door needs good wood. Beginning, middle, end. But the beauty is in the details, the decorations you add. She taught him about rhythm and pause, about reading faces and adjusting words like a carpenter adjusts measurements. She taught him that silence could be as powerful as speech, that a well-placed pause was like a perfectly fitted joint. The village children became his first audience. They gathered eagerly whenever they saw him coming, knowing that Ike would paint worlds for them. He told them old stories Amayam had shared, but also new ones he discovered in daily life. "Did you hear about the argument between the rooster and the sun?" he would begin, and the children would lean in, eyes bright. But the adults still watched with confusion. Owos particularly enjoyed mocking these sessions. "Look at the carpenter's son," he would say, building castles in the air. Kahind was gentler but no less puzzled. "Why waste time with children's tales?" he asked. "You could still learn a trade. Farming, perhaps?" Ike would smile and nod, but inside, something was growing. A certainty as solid as any door his father had built. The dry season came harsh that year, dropping the river so low that the wooden bridge connecting Akuka to the market town began to strain. Abere and other carpenters reinforced it, but everyone could see the truth. The bridge was dying. "We need unity," the chief declared at a village meeting. "Everyone must contribute to building a new bridge before the rains return." Men pledged labor. Women pledged food for the workers. The wealthy pledged materials. Then the chief's eyes fell on Ike. "And you, son of Abere? What will you contribute?" The silence stretched like a taut rope. Ike felt the weight of expectation, the pressure to pledge something, anything that would prove his worth. "I will contribute stories," he said at last. The laughter started as a ripple and grew to a wave. Even the chief struggled to keep his face neutral. "Stories," Owos called out. "Will stories carry our goods to market? Will stories hold the weight of our cattle?" But Ike stood firm, though his knees trembled. "When the work grows hard and spirits flag, I will tell stories to make the labor lighter. When arguments arise, as they always do in great undertakings, I will tell stories to remind us why we build together." The chief raised his hand in silence. "Very well," he said, though his tone suggested he expected little. "We shall see what stories can build." The bridge building began with enthusiasm. The whole village threw themselves into the task, knowing their survival depended on connection to the market. But as days turned to weeks, the initial excitement wore thin. The sun beat down mercilessly. Hands blistered. Backs ached. Tempers grew short as exhaustion set in. By the third week, arguments erupted over everything from the placement of supports to the distribution of water. It was then that Ike began his work. During the midday break, when workers sprawled in whatever shade they could find, he would stand and begin. "Let me tell you about the first bridge ever built," he would say, his voice carrying across the work site. At first, only the children listened. But as Ike wove tales of clever animals outsmarting rivers and of ancestors who bound communities together with more than just wood and rope, the adults found themselves leaning in. He told funny stories that made tired men laugh. He told inspiring stories that reminded them why they labored. Most importantly, he told stories about Akuka itself, about their shared history and dreams. Remember when the great drought came? He would begin, and suddenly everyone was nodding, remembering how their parents and grandparents had survived by working together. Slowly, the mood at the work site changed. Men who had been ready to fight found themselves laughing together instead. When disagreements arose, someone would call out, "Ike, tell us the story about the two stubborn goats." One day, a stranger arrived at the bridge site. He wore the robes of a traveling merchant, but his eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen many villages and many bridges. He watched the work for hours, saying nothing. But his gaze lingered longest on Ike, standing among the workers, gesturing animatedly as he told another tale. During the evening meal, the stranger approached Abere. "Your son," he said. "He is the one who tells stories?" Abere nodded, not sure if pride or shame colored his answer. "I have traveled from the coast to the desert," the stranger continued. "I have seen bridges built with sweat and bridges built with songs. But never have I seen what I saw today." "What did you see?" Abere asked. "I saw men building not because they had to, but because they wanted to. I saw enemies becoming friends over shared laughter. I saw a bridge being built twice, once with wood and once with words." The stranger smiled. "Your son may not build doors, but he builds something far more difficult. He builds unity." That night, Abere looked at his son with new eyes. He began to understand that there were many ways to follow in a father's footsteps, many ways to build things that last. The stranger left the next morning, but not before seeking out Ike. "Keep building," he said simply. "The world needs more bridges like yours." The bridge was nearly complete when the rains came early. Not gentle warning drops, but a sudden deluge that caught everyone unprepared. The river, so low for so long, remembered its strength all at once. "The support," someone shouted. "They're not fully set. The bridge will wash away." Panic spread as quickly as the rising water. All their work, all their unity, threatened to disappear in muddy torrents. Some ran for ropes, others for stones. But what could they do against the river's sudden rage? In the chaos, Ike found himself at the bridge's entrance, watching their dreams sway in the current. Without thinking, he began to speak. Not to the people this time, but to the bridge itself, to the river, to the rain. "You are not enemies," he called out, his voice somehow carrying over the storm. "River, you have carried our boats and cooled our children. Bridge, you seek to honor the river, not conquer it. Rain, you bring life, not destruction." People stopped their panicking and rushed to listen. Even in crisis, they had learned to hear when Ike spoke. "We built this bridge with unity," Ike continued, walking onto the swaying structure. "Not just unity of people, but unity with the land, with the water, with the sky. We are not separate from nature. We are part of its story." As he spoke, something shifted. Not in the bridge or the river, but in the people. What happened next would be told in Akuka for generations. Instead of fighting the river with force, the villagers began to work with it. Guided by a strange calm that seemed to flow from Mike's words, they moved together like a single organism. Some waded into the water to guide debris away from the supports. Others formed human chains to shore up weak points. The women began to sing, their voices weaving with Ike's continuous story about harmony between human need and nature's power. Even Owos, who had mocked Ike for so long, found himself working with newfound purpose. "Tell them about the time the river and the mountain made peace," he shouted to Ike, surprising himself with the request. Through the night they worked, Ike's voice grew hoarse but never stopped. He told every story he knew about cooperation, about wisdom, about finding strength in gentleness. When he ran out of old stories, he created new ones, weaving the night's events into legend even as they happened. By dawn, the rain had gentled to a drizzle. The river still ran high, but the bridge stood firm. More than stood, it seemed to belong there, as if it had grown from the landscape rather than been built upon it. Exhausted villagers collapsed on the muddy ground, but their faces showed joy, not defeat. They had saved more than a bridge. They had discovered something about It's not about conquering. It's about joining. My father joins wood to wood. I try to join heart to heart. News of the bridge's survival spread to neighboring villages. People came to see the structure that had withstood the early rains, but more than that, they came to understand how it had been built. They found a village transformed. Where before there had been the usual divisions and petty quarrels, now there was something different. Not perfection. Akuka was still made of humans with all their flaws. But there was a cohesion, a sense of shared story that made conflicts easier to resolve and joys sweeter to share. What happened here? Visitors would ask. The villagers would point to the bridge, then to Ike, then struggle to explain. How could they describe the power of stories to people who had not felt it? Some visitors scoffed. Stories are for children and old women, they said. But others listened more carefully, especially when they learned that Ike was the son of Abere, the master carpenter. He builds differently than his father, they would observe. Yes, the villagers would agree proudly. He builds doors in the mind and bridges in the heart. Even Owos, once Ike's harshest critic, became one of his strongest supporters. I used to think strength was in the arm, he would tell people. But Ike showed us strength can be in the voice, in the story that reminds us who we are. Kahind added his own understanding. A door of wood keeps some things out and lets others in. But a door of words? It can open hearts that have been closed for years. As word spread, people began coming to Ike not for entertainment, but for help. A family divided by an old quarrel. A young couple struggling to understand each other. Children are afraid of the dark. Elders feeling forgotten. Ike received them all, usually under the great baobab tree where he had first truly listened to Amayam. He would hear their troubles, nod thoughtfully, and then begin, "Let me tell you a story." But he did more than tell stories. He began teaching others how to find and share their own tales. He showed them that everyone carried stories inside them, memories that could teach, experiences that could heal, dreams that could inspire. The door to understanding is always there, he would say. We just need to learn how to open it. Young people particularly gathered around him, including some who, like him, had failed to master their family trades. He helped them see that there were many ways to contribute to a community, many forms of strength and skill. One girl who could not weave like her mother discovered she could sing stories that made people weep with joy. A boy who failed at farming found he could act out tales that had children rolling with laughter. We are not failures, Ike told them. We are doors that open differently. Old Amayam, now very frail, would sit and listen with tears in her cloudy eyes. You have surpassed the teacher, she whispered to him one day. No, Ike replied gently. I have simply opened the door you showed me existed. Abere had watched his son's transformation with wonder and not a little confusion. The boy who could not join two pieces of wood now joined entire communities. The hands that fumbled with hammers now gestured with grace as they painted worlds in the air. One evening, Abere approached his son. Teach me, he said simply. Ike looked at his father in surprise. Teach you what? You are the master craftsman. I master wood, Abere said. You master something I do not understand. But I want to learn. So began an unusual apprenticeship. In the mornings, Abere would work in his shop, and Ike would join him, not to build, but to learn the stories hidden in each piece of wood. In the evenings, Ike would share tales, and Abere would listen, trying to understand how words could be tools. This knot in the wood, Abere would say, it tells of a hard year when the tree struggled to grow. Yes, Ike would exclaim. And that's like the story of the village that survived the great drought. Struggle leaves marks, but also strength. Gradually, Abere began incorporating stories into his work. When he built a door, he would think of what story it might tell. When customers came, he would share not just the price and the quality, but the tale of the wood's journey. His doors became more than barriers or entrances. They became narratives in grain and polish. People would run their hands over the carvings and remember the stories Abere had shared. "We are both door makers," Abere said one day. "Just different kinds." Not everyone celebrated Ike's gift. In the neighboring village of Ikeel, there lived a man named Chitty who prided himself on being modern and practical. He had heard of Ike and scoffed. "Stories are for the old days," Chitty declared. "What Africa needs is development, not fairy tales. We need builders, not dreamers." He came to Akuka with a challenge. "I will bring real progress," he announced in the village square. "I will teach your young people useful skills, accounting, mechanics, things that matter in today's world. Let them choose between stories and success." Some of the youth were swayed. After all, Chitty spoke of money and machines, of cities and opportunities. What could stories offer compared to that? A contest was arranged. For one moon, Chitty would teach his modern skills while Ike continued with his stories. Then the village would see which served them better. Chitty worked hard, teaching numbers and showing pictures of city life. He promised jobs and wealth to those who learned his ways. Several young people, including some Ike had been teaching, joined Chitty's classes. Ike felt the sting, but continued as always, gathering those who still came, sharing tales under the baobab tree. But his audiences grew smaller, and doubt crept into his heart. "Perhaps Chitty is right," he confided to his father. "Perhaps I am holding our people back with old ways." Abere placed a weathered hand on his son's shoulder. "A door serves its purpose whether made of modern steel or ancient wood. The question is, what are you trying to open?" The moon passed quickly. On the final day, both teachers would demonstrate what their students had learned. Chitty went first, his students displaying their new knowledge. They calculated profits, demonstrated basic mechanics, and spoke of business plans. The village elders nodded appreciatively. These were indeed useful skills. Several young people already had promises of work in the city. Then came Ike's turn. His remaining students didn't calculate or demonstrate. Instead, they performed. They acted out the history of Akuka, from its founding to the present day. They sang of the bridge building, making everyone remember that night of unity. They told personal stories of reconciliation and understanding. One young woman shared how Ike's stories had helped her forgive her estranged sister. A boy demonstrated how he used storytelling to teach younger children about respecting elders. An old man spoke of how the stories had given him purpose in his final years. When they finished, the square was silent. Then Chitty spoke, very touching. "But can stories put food on the table? Can they build hospitals or schools?" Before I could respond, a voice called from the crowd. It was the traveling merchant who had visited during the bridge building. "I have returned," he said, "because of what I saw here before. In the city, I told others about this village where stories built bridges stronger than stone. Do you know what happened?" He paused, letting anticipation build. 3 schools want to study your methods. A foundation wants to fund a storytelling center here. Publishers want to record your tales. Tour groups want to visit the village where words work magic. He turned to Chitty. "You ask if stories can put food on the table? This village's stories could feed it for generations." But Ike raised his hand. "No," he said, surprising everyone. "That is not why we tell stories." He stood and addressed the crowd. "Chitty is not wrong. We need modern skills. We need development. But we also need to remember who we are as we develop. We need stories not because they bring money, but because they bring meaning." He looked at the young people who had studied with Chitty. "Go to the city. Learn. Grow. But take your stories with you. Remember where you come from. And when you build your modern buildings, remember the bridge we built with unity." Then he turned to his own students. "And you who stay, don't hide from the new world. Learn from it. But help it learn from you too. Show that progress doesn't mean forgetting the past." Chitty, who had expected to leave in triumph, found himself strangely moved. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "there is room for both. Perhaps I could learn some of your stories to share in my city classes." The merchant smiled. "Now that is wisdom." not choosing between old and new, but opening doors between them. That night, the village celebrated not victory but balance. Chitty stayed several more days, sitting with Ike under the baobab tree, learning stories to carry back to the city. And Ike asked Chitty to teach him about the wider world, so his stories could help prepare young people for it. "We are all door makers," Ike said, echoing his father's words. "Some doors lead out, some lead in, but all connect." Years passed. Akuka became known as the village of stories, attracting visitors from far and wide. But more importantly, it became a place of deep harmony. Not perfect harmony. People still quarreled and struggled. But when conflicts arose, someone would say, "What story do we need to hear?" and resolution would become possible. Ike, now a young man with gray beginning to touch his temples, had become more than a storyteller. He was a keeper of doors, doors between hearts, between generations, between tradition and change. One day, important visitors arrived. Government officials, they said, looking for someone to help with a national problem. Communities across the country were fracturing, torn between old ways and new, between different tribes and religions. "We heard about your bridge," they told the chief. "Not the wooden one, though that still stands strong. The other bridges, between people. We need someone who can build those bridges for the nation." All eyes turned to Ike. He sat quietly thinking. Such recognition, such opportunity, but also such responsibility. "I cannot build bridges for the nation," he said at last. The officials looked disappointed, but Ike continued. "I can only teach others to build their own. Every community has its stories. Every person is a door waiting to open. I can show them how, but they must do the opening." The officials conferred, then nodded. "Then teach. Travel and teach. Help our nation remember how to tell its stories to itself." Ike looked at his father, now old but still strong. Abere smiled. A carpenter's son must eventually leave his father's workshop. Go. Open doors I never dreamed of. The night before Ike left, all of Akuka gathered. It was not a sad occasion, but a celebration. Owos, now a master fisherman with children of his own, stood to speak. "I mocked you once," he said to Ike. "I said you built castles in the air. I was wrong. You built foundations in our hearts." Behind, a successful farmer and village leader, added his voice. "You showed us that failure is just finding a different door than expected. My son cannot farm, but he tells stories like you. I no longer worry for him." One by one, villagers shared how Ike's stories had changed them. The woman whose marriage was saved. The man who reconciled with his brother. The children who learned pride in their heritage. The elders who found a new purpose. Amayam, ancient now but still sharp, was helped to stand. "I taught you to tell stories," she said, her voice like rustling leaves. "But you taught us why stories matter. You opened the door I only pointed to." Finally, Abere stood. The master carpenter, whose hands had shaped so much wood, whose doors protected every home in Akuka, looked at his son with pride that needed no words. "You never built a door," he said, "but you became one. A door between worlds, between hearts, between what is and what could be." No carpenter could ask for a better legacy. Ike embraced his father, feeling the calluses of honest work against his own unmarked hands. Different tools, same purpose. Different doors, same love. "I will return," Ike promised. Every door needs a home to return to. Years later, when old men sit under the baobab tree and children gather with eager eyes, they tell the story of the carpenter's son who never built a door. They speak of Ike, who traveled the land opening hearts with words, who showed that strength comes in many forms, and that the greatest doors are invisible to the eye but clear to the soul. They tell of his return visits to Akuka, hair white as foam but spirit young as dawn. How he would sit in his father's workshop, empty now of the old carpenter's presence, but full of his memory. How he would run his fingers over the doors Abere built, still standing strong, and smile at the stories carved in their grain. "My father was right," he would tell the young ones who thought themselves failures. "We both built doors. He kept out the rain and wind. Mine let in understanding and hope. Both are needed. Both last forever in their own way." The children would ask, "But Uncle Ike, Why could you not build a wooden door? Why did your hands not work like your father's? And Ike would laugh, that warm sound like honey poured over bitter herbs. Because, little ones, if I had built doors like my father, I would have been too busy to notice that people needed different kinds of openings. Sometimes what looks like failure is just life showing you a door you didn't know existed. He would point to young Adise, who stuttered when she spoke, but whose drawings made people weep. To little Emeka, whose legs would not run but whose mind soared higher than eagles. To all the children who felt less than, who carried the weight of expectations they could not meet. You are not broken doors, he would tell them. You are doors that open differently. The world needs all kinds of doors. And in the evening, when the cooking fires sent smoke spiraling to the stars, Ike would stand where his father once stood. Not holding tools of wood and metal, but tools of memory and meaning. He would begin to speak, and even the crickets would quiet to listen. Let me tell you about my father, he would say. The greatest carpenter Akuka ever knew. He built doors that still stand today. But his greatest creation was not something he built with his hands. It was the space he gave me to find my own way. The love that let me fail. The wisdom to see that a carpenter's true job is not just to shape wood, but to shape possibilities. The elders would nod, remembering. The young would lean forward, learning. And in that moment, under the vast African sky, everyone understood that the story of the carpenter's son who never built a door was really the story of every child who must find their own way, every parent who must let them, and every community that grows stronger when it makes room for different kinds of strength. So when you see a door, Ike would conclude, his voice soft as settling dust, remember that it is more than wood and iron. It is a choice. To open or close. To welcome or refuse. To connect or divide. My father taught me that every person is both a door and a key. The question is, what will you choose to open? And long after Ike's voice faded into memory, long after the last person who knew him had joined the ancestors, the story lived on. In every village where someone felt they didn't fit. In every workshop where a parent struggled to understand a different child. In every heart that learned to see failure as just another kind of door. The carpenter's son who never built a door had built something better. He had built a story that would never close, a door that would never rot, a bridge that would never fall. He had shown that sometimes the greatest builders are those who build with the invisible, the impossible, the everlasting. And under the baobab tree in Akuka, where the red earth meets the endless sky, the children still gather, still listen, still learn that there are many ways to build a door, and the ones that matter most are the ones that open hearts.